So we'll be recording this. We'll also have a live transcript. If you want to activate your closed captioning, you can do that at the bottom of your screen with the live transcript button. Thank you. I'm Corey Steiern. I'm the Director of Community Services here in Los Alamos County. We have engaged the WT group to help us look at our community and see if there are better ways that we can open up our primarily parks and recreation facilities to everyone. One of the first things I saw when I got here a little over a year ago is we have several areas that are not conducive to people that may be mobility challenged. We have some issues with opportunities for those that may be sight impaired or hearing impaired that we're not fully doing. So this is our part of that is to do this, and then also we need to become compliant with federal law with our audit and transition plan that was updated in 2010 that we need to be following. As part of our county team tonight, we have Linda Lundstrom and Catherine Hudspeth with us tonight. So if you want to say hey.
Hello.
Good evening, everybody.
And then I'm going to turn it over you to John and let you run us through this process.
All right, thanks, Corey. My name is John McGovern, and I lead the accessibility practice at the WT Group. We, since 2008, have helped counties and cities and special districts comply with the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And with me tonight are Jay Rhodes and Tatum Story. And Jay and Tatum, I'll ask you to introduce yourselves.
Tatum, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Tatum Story. I am an accessibility specialist with WT Group. I do a lot of the auditing. I actually went to Los Alamos, so a lot of the stuff that you will be seeing is stuff that I found during my time there.
Very good. Thanks, Tatum. And I'm Jay Rhodes. I'm also with the WT Group, project manager, registered architect, and ADA coordinator. So look forward to meeting everyone in person there in Los Alamos soon.
Great. And Linda, you said we had some others in attendance?
So we have Terry Fox, Lisa Reeder, and I believe Melissa Arias has returned.
Was Terry Fox in the meeting this afternoon?
I believe so.
All right. Terry, would you like to introduce yourself again to the group?
And mute. Okay. All right. Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Terry Fox. I've been working on accessibility of trails in the area. I've done about 25 trails. I use a rollator walker. Many years ago when I was able, I walked all these trails. So I look at them very differently now that I have a disability. I'm back because I wanted to hear the presentation again. I've learned a lot from John's presentation first time. So I'm not going to particularly talk, but just listen. Thank you very much.
So Terry, since you paid attention, you'll be able to jump in if I miss something, right?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Linda, who else do we have?
We have Melissa Arias, who I believe introduced herself and can introduce herself again, and Lisa Reeder.
Hi, Melissa.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. All I'm seeing on my screen is Lemonade Living.
So normally on a Zoom meeting, I have the option to change the name, and I don't see that option on this particular screen. So, but my name is Melissa Arias, and I'm with Lemonade Living, and that is my interest because we do serve individuals with developmental and physical disabilities. And I'm at the stables right now. We spend a lot of time at the stables and other places in the community, and we definitely want access for our members and loved ones and for our sister organizations within the Developmental Disabilities and Special Needs Roundtable of Los Alamos. So that's my interest. And hello, and thank you all for doing this. And I'm going to be quiet and let Lisa Reeder go.
Well, actually, don't be quiet yet. Melissa, where did you get the name Lemonade Living for the organization?
Well, our tagline is making life sweet. Sometimes situations can be frustrating, and you know, what we're talking about tonight, it can be frustrating and sometimes create a sour situation without access to recreation facilities, social events, all sorts of things. And our aim is to make life sweet by helping connect people with resources and participate in things like this that can help widen access for our community. So, and lemons are really good. So we actually started out as Lemonade Therapy Co-op of Los Alamos, and then when we initially formed our board, they said, let's take therapy out of it and let's shorten it and make it simple. So we're Lemonade Living. And part of what we do, part of the initial goal was to carry on into adulthood, the living skills program that the kids have at the high school, but when they age out, they lose all of those services.
Right.
And we wanted to be able to continue what they do, but then put into it what we wanted to add, bring in more recreation and more of the individual interests of the clients that we serve. So
Great.
now I'll be quiet.
Thanks, Melissa.
I'm
And that's a great name. No one's going to forget that.
sorry. Thank you. Well, Lisa Reeder helped with that, so I'm gonna let her talk.
Hi, Lisa.
Hello. Yeah, my name's Lisa Reeder. I've been in town probably close to 30 years. Hi, Corey. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Linda. Besides being involved at the stable quite a bit, I have 2 adult children with cerebral palsy, one of whom uses a wheelchair and still lives in town here. And one of my larger things that I was involved in was actually getting Atomic City Transit up and functioning and having the dial-a-ride, which made it possible for my daughter to get around. My other interest is that my 86-year-old mother has moved here and she's vision impaired. So I'm looking at a lot of things through that lens at the moment too. So anxious to hear what you guys have got going on and what the county's plans might be.
All right. Well, yes.
Can I jump in real quick? I didn't mention, Lisa mentioned her family. I think a lot of our interest is family driven. And for me, it's my daughter as well. She lives with autism, and I have to say, we spend a lot, like I said, Lisa and I both and our families spend a lot of time at the stables, and my daughter is constantly talking about the trails. She wants to be able to spend more time on the trails. So I'm really excited also about the grant that y'all just secured, Corey and Catherine and Linda and whoever all participated in that. So anyway, that's it. Sorry.
Nope. We have a small enough crowd in the room tonight that when people hear something that you want to comment on, just interrupt. Don't feel like you have to wait till the end. So let me just briefly talk about the scope of work, and then I'll talk a little bit about who we are, and then we'll take a dip into some of the ADA requirements with a focus on how they apply to facilities. So the scope of work has 3 principal components to it. One is to conduct access audits of all of the parks and facilities within the Community Services Department. 2 is to conduct the mandated community engagement opportunities. So just as an aside, Los Alamos decided to do more than is required here and is doing this early 2 sessions, and then we'll do sessions closer toward the end of the project as well. But again, here, the county is doing more than the minimum requirements because they also included in the scope of work a statistically valid and reliable community survey. So we do have a subcontractor who was on the call, the meeting this afternoon, RRC Associates, and they do Parks and Recreation statistically valid and reliable surveys all the time, and we're excited to work with them on this project. And that particular task will probably occur sometime in the first quarter of 2022. The third part of our scope is what's called a transition plan, and it's really just a phased schedule of what retrofits are going to occur at what sites in what year. So as I indicated, we'll talk a little bit more as we go through the next hour or so about the definition of some of the terms in here. And we'll give you some examples of what other jurisdictions have done as well. So our group, we're part of a group that includes architects and engineers, but our accessibility practice does just ADA compliance. So we specialize in site evaluations or access audits. We do a fair amount of community engagement. Every one of our clients has asked us for a transition plan. We do a lot of plan review to make sure that the new project gets done right the first time. And we also do a fair amount of reviewing how agencies invite, analyze, and then fulfill requests for reasonable modification from a person with a disability. Lastly, we do a fair amount of staff training. Corey, if I recall, one of the value added services we stuck in here was staff training for you all at the end of the project. So we'll look forward to being out there and doing that sometime in the spring, I hope. So I know everybody in the room is familiar with the ADA, but just a couple of elementary pieces here. First, it became effective January 26th of 1992, and it was an unusual law when it was adopted. It was voted yes for by 85% of the members of the House and the Senate on both sides of the aisle. We certainly would not see that today. And in my mind, it's really one of the last big consensus, both parties agree, piece of civil rights legislation. It's especially important for people who have a disability, obviously because of the protections it provides, but it goes far beyond earlier laws that prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability. Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, which most of us are familiar with, only applied to agencies that receive federal funds. So Congress and the Department of Justice said, we don't think that's fair. There are a lot of jurisdictions and certainly a lot of the 7 million businesses that don't receive federal funds. So the ADA is unique in that it applies whether you have ever received federal funds or not. And certainly Los Alamos County, I'm sure, has received federal funds. So to a certain extent, some of this is moot. But the ADA requirements far exceed, especially with regard to existing facilities, Section 504. Some of the key areas of the ADA are Title I regarding employment, where employers are prohibited from discriminating on the basis of disability. That's not in our scope. Title II deals with state and local government services, so that certainly is our scope. That's exactly what Los Alamos County is, and so we'll apply the Department of Justice Title II regulations to our work for the county. Title III addresses businesses and nonprofits that are open to the public. So a privately owned business like a bank or a Starbucks or a car dealer or a Planet Fitness. Those aren't clubs, they're just businesses. They're no different than a restaurant or a hotel. And the same applies to nonprofits. So a YMCA or a Boys and Girls Club. Those are also subject to Title III. Typically, Title III entities have a lower bar to meet before they can raise their hand and say, we're not going to provide this modification. Title III is also not within our scope here going forward. Lastly is telecommunications. The ADA was the moving force behind every state phone system or phone operator creating the relay service so that it's in every state. To a certain extent, this is a good example of a piece of legislation that has become outdated because almost all of us have a cell phone and we can text back and forth whether somebody has a communication impairment or not. Let's take a little deeper dive into Title II. So as we mentioned, Title II governs not just facilities and parks, but all of the services that the county provides. With regard to facilities, there's two sets of requirements, and they're both slightly different. First, in the Title II regulation, Section 35.151 requires the county for all design and construction of new sites to make those sites fully compliant with the bottom bullet point. So the 2010 standards for accessible design or the New Mexico Building Code in its latest version, if it is more stringent. And then of course, we always recommend that counties adhere to and apply smart practices, because even though the 2010 standards are 220 pages long, they are far from finished. With regard to existing sites, the requirement is different. For new, you have to design it and build it compliant. For existing sites, you have to audit the sites, determine what the deficits are, and then put a schedule together for when you're going to retrofit it. We briefly discussed that at the beginning. I think this is a good place to say that we think accessibility is a function of three factors. One is how the site was designed. Two is how the site was constructed or installed. And three is how the site is maintained. So you'll see some images coming up where you might arguably be able to say, hey, there's a little bit of a design problem here, there's a little bit of a construction problem here, and there's a little bit of a maintenance problem here. But that's not why we're at the site. We're at the site just to determine what the as-builts look like and whether they are in compliance. A couple other Title II concepts that are really, really critical to the framework of the ADA. The top bullet point requires the county at Section 35.130D to make its programs available in the most integrated setting. So if I want to take a golf lesson, or if I want to take some other kind of a program that the county wants and I have a disability, I get to take it with people who don't have a disability if that's my preference. The county can also provide separate or specialized programs, but I always have the right to participate in the most integrated setting. Related to that, and this is kind of the piece that makes inclusion succeed, is that the county must make modifications to support participation by people with disabilities. So the Title II regulation, and for that matter, the statute, both do a pretty good job of giving you a list of about 9 things that have to be done. And they range from things that don't cost anything, like changes to rules and policies, to things that do cost, like providing a sign language interpreter or hiring extra staff or providing more training for staff who are going to be working with a person with a disability, or acquiring and providing adaptive equipment, or even, and I didn't mention this today, providing home visits. So certainly during 2020 and early 2021, we saw a lot of community services departments and parks and recreation agencies do some form of home visit, in particular for people with disabilities who were considered a little bit more at risk and could not go to the community center the way they used to. The third bullet point is also an important piece. Many counties, many cities contract out to run certain programs. Maybe a business runs a golf course for a county or a swimming pool, or they may just be concessionaires providing kayak rentals, for example, or canoe rentals. If that's the case, the agreement between the county and these contractors or concessionaires has to require that the contractor and concessionaire will not discriminate on the basis of disability. And it makes the county, in a sense, the Department of Justice. The county's the one that has to enforce this if indeed a contractor or a concessionaire does discriminate on the basis of disability. Last on this slide is that the county must also ensure that the processes that people who have a disability have to go through to participate in programs are not more difficult than the processes for people without a disability. In the session this afternoon, I used an example from New Jersey where the agency knew that they had to provide reasonable modifications, but they said after registration, if you wanted a reasonable modification, you had to call the director of Parks and Recreation. Well, that's unnecessary, and that's exactly the kind of requirement that suppresses participation. So the Department of Justice has been really clear that processes like that, that make people with a disability take more steps, are, in a sense, discriminatory against them. I briefly mentioned program access. That's a real key to how you view existing facilities. And don't think of programs here as something that you register for that meets every Monday at 3:30 in the afternoon and runs through Fridays at 3:30 in the afternoon. Programs are really broadly defined, and I would encourage you to think of them as an opportunity. So if I can grab a Blake's Lotta burger with green chili and find a picnic table in a park and sit down and eat it and enjoy nature, then that's a program. You having that picnic table there is a program. It's an invitation to me. If I want to go to a Los Alamos County board meeting and make public comment, that's a program. So public comment has to be accessible to me, both physically and from a communication perspective. It does certainly include classes and programs that you register for and pay a fee for, but it also includes the program of trails, the program of viewing areas. So those kind of physical assets are really a program in the eyes of the Department of Justice. DOJ has also made it clear that this isn't a mandate that every single existing site has to be made accessible, or that every asset as a site must be retrofit for access. So I think I used the example earlier today of if a park has 5 picnic tables, one of them has to be served by an accessible route, and the picnic table has to be of a design that is compliant with the design requirements. Same for playgrounds. Not necessarily every playground has to be accessible. The Department of Justice has not set a ratio here. They've had 30 years to do it and they have not. So I would not count on them doing it in the next 30 years either. We've always recommended a minimum of 1 of every 3 existing sites be made accessible. And so then as playgrounds are replaced in 2026, because they're now 22 years old, then that's new construction and it has to be made accessible. So it becomes the 11th of 30 playgrounds. And then next year you get the 12th of 30 playgrounds. So it's kind of a blend between the new construction requirements and the transition plan approach. As far as the schedule, there's not guidance here unless you are in a dispute. And by a dispute, I mean a settlement agreement or a court decision. If you lose in court or if you lose in a settlement agreement, you're going to make every single retrofit within 3 to 4 years. If you stay in the driver's seat by acting in good faith, developing a good relationship with your communities of people who have disabilities, then you can make the schedule meet your resources, but it's got to be in a way that's consistent with the ADA mandate. I do think it's important to emphasize a point I just made. I don't think I mentioned this this afternoon. We encourage the county, and as we do with all of our county and city clients, to not think of the disability community as a monolith. If I have a son or daughter on the autism spectrum, my interests are completely different than if I use a rollator, if I can use your device, Terry. And same if I am deaf or hard of hearing or blind. So it's important to understand that each of those communities may have different priorities, and it's important to be able to juggle those. Come on. So why audit facilities? I think it's important as the county continues to address its own infrastructure, as every county does, that knowing where the access deficits are can be tied into the plans for basic facility management principles. So it's important to the county to know where those access issues exist. I think it's also important to acknowledge that many sites were planned before 1992, and access wasn't necessarily in the mindset of the designers. So auditing and being aware of the issues at sites will help the county stay current. But lastly, it's just the right thing to do. Los Alamos County doesn't want to have a site that can only be used by people who don't have a disability. And that just makes sense since, again, it's the right thing to do. So a little bit about our process. Actually, Tatum, since you were an implementer, I didn't ask you about this earlier. Can you talk a little bit about Bluedag and the process that we use, what tools we use and so forth?
Yeah, so we use an app on our phones called Bluedag. This app is an accessibility app that allows us to create checklists so that we can go through questions and mark information based on what we're seeing while we're on site. We use a door gauge, a pressure gauge, to check how much force it takes to open a door. We use a tape measure so that we can measure things like entryways and stairs and steps and gaps and changes in level. And then we also use a 2-foot level so that we can, check levels for walking paths and spaces that you might walk on inside and outside. We use Bluedag, and when we're using it, we're writing the report that we end up giving to our clients while we're working. So while we're out there on the field, we're writing this report, taking photos. With Bluedag, we take photos. So when we get the report to our clients, you can see exactly what's wrong and know how to make the changes for it.
Yeah, I'll just reference what Tatum said. As we're collecting the data in the field with Bluedag, it sends the data to the cloud. I don't know what the cloud is, but I trust it. I've seen the reports it generates, and we do strive for clarity. We want you, when you have the report in your hands, to know exactly which parking stall we're talking about or exactly which section of the trail we're referring to.
Yeah, the photo abilities with the app is really nice, so that you can really pinpoint exactly what's wrong and exactly where you might make your changes and modifications.
Thank you, Tatum.
Yeah.
So what is a transition plan? This is one of the key deliverables. It has 4 specific components. One is that you're supposed to cite or describe the deficit. 2, you're supposed to recommend a solution. And the solution can be leave as is or site construction tolerance. 3, you're supposed to name the responsible person who will make sure that that barrier is resolved. And then 4, you're supposed to note when the barrier will be removed. We know from our own careers in local government, 5 of us worked in local government, that no county can put a plan together like this without having a rough idea of what the heck the cost is going to be for the retrofits. So we do add cost references for planning purposes to our version of the transition plan. I think another key to an effective transition plan is to disperse the access retrofits. You don't want to have all of phase 1 in Los Alamos and none of it in White Rock, for example. So you want to try to spread the work that you're going to do around. And there are a series of factors here that we'll talk about in a couple of slides that can help you with dispersion. You do want to address recurring sites. I talked earlier about the playground example, but you also want to address unique sites. If there is only one county administration building, it's probably going to have a higher priority. If there is only one stables, it's probably going to have a higher priority for retrofit. And I alluded to this earlier, but you know, we work with our county and municipal clients to figure out what's the right number of years. We urge them to every year budget for and expend resources on making transition plan retrofits. But it's typical for a Parks and Recreation transition plan that we've worked on to see it take 8 to 10 to maybe at the outside 12 years. The next couple slides just talk about some of the transition plan factors that we've seen other jurisdictions do. So as we go through this process, we will talk to Corey and the staff about their feedback on this, but we also want your feedback, those of you from the public. So one of these is the severity of the barrier. If there is supposed to be an accessible route to something new that's been constructed and there's not, it's just dirt or grass, we're going to identify that as a severe barrier. And that can be a factor that you rate higher as far as what gets retrofit and when. Kind of the exact opposite is also possible. And that's making a high priority of the low-hanging fruit, the retrofits that you can do with current human and fiscal resources. This has proven to be pretty popular for a lot of our clients who want a way to make sure that staff buy into this. And so they pick things that require staff time only so that everybody has a little bit higher accessibility awareness with regard to facilities and parks. We've also had an increasing number of counties and cities tell us that they want to make their higher use sites have a higher priority. So in other words, if we're going to spend $300,000 on a site, we'd rather make it the site that draws the most participation as opposed to the site that is 40th on our list. We've also seen as a priority a differentiation between public spaces or employee spaces. So again, I'll use the same number. If we're going to spend $400,000 on retrofits, we'd rather make an emphasis on those retrofit dollars going to spaces used by the public as opposed to employee spaces. It's important to add a caveat here. Certainly, Title I of the ADA requires the county, or any county for that matter, that if an employee acquires a disability, or if they hire a candidate who happens to have a disability, that that person's workstation will likely be made accessible. But from a balancing of where do the resources go, we've seen some jurisdictions take this approach. The recency of construction is another factor. So I talked about the 2010 standards becoming effective March 15, 2012, at least I think I did. If we have a facility that was designed and constructed March 15 of 2014, so it should be new, which means it should be fully compliant. And when we audit it, we find that it is not. We will recommend that as a higher priority because it's exposure in the sense that it was built and it didn't comply. Kind of on the flip side of that are repurposed sites. It's not unusual to see Parks and Recreation or community service agencies get that school that was built in 1900 and is no longer useful as a school, but it goes to the Parks and Recreation Agency as a senior center or as a recreation center. So those are difficult to retrofit. So those tend to be a later priority. We also see a lot of counties that have either a municipal partner, maybe the state is a partner, maybe it's a business or a nonprofit at a facility. And in that event, if there are retrofits to be made, that typically winds up being later in the priority list. It gives the county and the partner a chance to agree on when are we going to do it, how are we going to pay for it, which part are you going to pay for, and which part am I going to pay for. We also see complex or costly retrofits being put off toward the later phases, giving the county or the city an opportunity to bank some resources so that they can tackle the project. Lastly, on this slide, and this is an important one, we heard this in the meeting this afternoon, and we've already heard it again tonight too. There are some jurisdictions that have said we do not want to put sites that are not yet subject to a design standard as a higher priority. And for you, that includes some of your signature sites. The U.S. Access Board did finish design guidance, but it is not yet a final and enforceable standard for trails, campsites, picnic areas, viewing areas, beaches, and constructed furniture in parks, like a grill, for example. So we typically, if you'll recall earlier, I said that we encourage counties to adopt smart practices. So we think it's a smart practice here to take the highest federal level writing regarding trails, for example, and in a sense adopt that as a priority that's equal with the elements that are addressed in the 2010 standards. We do also see times when compliance is technically infeasible. One of the bigger differences between the 1991 standards and the 2010 standards is in regard to restrooms and whether certain clearances can overlap. So if this is a constructed restroom in a park that was built to meet the 1991 standards, you may not be able to meet the 2010 standards without moving or altering a load-bearing wall or element. So if that indeed is the case, then the county does not have to do that and can declare that work to be technically infeasible. This honestly isn't something that we see a lot, but it does arise. Historic sites are not exempt. We will audit a historic site the way we will any other site, but before retrofits can occur at a historic site, the county has to ask the state historic preservation officer whether the retrofits would threaten or destroy the historic significance of the site. So we've seen many retrofits at historic sites that work just fine. Don't think of this as an exemption. Think of it as a slightly different process on the back end. Then last but not least, we certainly see sites that have other protections for endangered species, flora or fauna, or are cultural or religious sites. So those may wind up, depending on the issue, being freed from meeting some of the technical requirements for accessibility. Okay, well, I was calling this show and tell when the staff were putting the pictures together, and in the week of November 5th, Tatum was part of the team that audited 27 sites or so. And as we go through this, I'll make some brief comments, but Tatum, I'll ask you to color it up a bit with some of the things that you saw.
All right.
So this top picture on the left is, it's pretty common. There's no accessible parking provided. We see this a lot in certain outdoor recreation settings. If you're going to have parking, then you have to have accessible parking. It's got to be on a firm and stable and slip resistant surface. It's got to be properly signed. It's got to be properly marked. So there's no exceptions there. Dirt and grass and pebbles are never an accessible route or an accessible surface either. In the middle, you can see a pretty angled slope for the parking stall and the access aisle. Those can't exceed 2.08% in any direction. And in the bottom picture, you can see that they're at about 3.5%. In the right, we see some accessible surface issues. Gaps can't exceed 1/2 inch. In that top picture, we're close to 6 inches. In the bottom picture, bottom right, where it looks like at about 3 inches, maybe 3.5. So Tatum, anything about these sites that you want to add to?
Not that I can think of. I know there are pictures coming up that I think I can add a little bit more to, so
All right.
I'll get to those then.
Top left, we see this a lot. Tatum, this is the rodeo arena, isn't it?
Yep.
So
Yeah.
we see this a lot at sports arenas where there's a desire to have a press box, number one. Number two, the press box size gets bigger because you put refrigerators in it and microwaves in it. Then somebody else wants a desk up there. Then it becomes a half office. So every time one of those things happens and you expand the footprint of that upper portion, then you're getting closer and closer to the vertical access requirements in the ADA. The picture to the left in the bottom, I think I described this afternoon as a really likely candidate for retrofit. That's a nice hard surface pavilion in the back with what looks like a stone route leading to it. So were that a paved or crushed stone route, that would be a great accessible asset within the site.
Yeah, and I think that was at North Mesa Picnic Grounds where there were multiple shelters where going into like the scoping and that 30% rule, maybe not making every single one of them accessible, but enough to meet that standard or that rule that we try to go by.
We talked a little bit earlier about accessibility being a function of three factors: design, construction or installation, and then maintenance. So in this picture in the center, you can see it's a simple maintenance issue. The loose gravel that's along that path poses both a bit of a safety issue as well as an accessibility issue. In reports, when we see things like this, we say, you know, this isn't a design issue, it's a maintenance issue. Have maintenance staff add this to their checklist.
I remember that site, the parking kind of interfered with the path a little bit and there was a pretty crazy slope, but the path itself was pretty paved. So even though the path was pretty accessible, there were some issues with getting to the path.
Were you at the site on the right?
The one in the center, the loose gravel along path, or?
No, the one that goes by the playground. It looks like there's a 15.1% slope.
Oh yeah, that was the 37th Street tot lot, I believe.
Good.
And there was a pretty crazy slope there.
So the maximum running slope is 8.33%. So this is a pretty significant departure. The cross slope at the bottom is at 2.3%. In another world, we might cite construction tolerance and suggest that could be left as is. But with the very steepness of the running slope, then we're likely going to recommend that both of these be retrofit. Here's a collection of some park assets that don't have accessible routes or accessible features. So in the picture on the left, we've got a blue picnic table in the foreground. I can't tell what color the one is in the background. A grill, a garbage can, and one of each of those in the park should be on an accessible route. So for one of every 5, there needs to be an accessible route that connects those. And as the county adds things like a dog waste plastic bag dispenser, that too has to be along an accessible route. Assets like this water fountain that are in the park, those too need to be compliant. This obviously isn't compliant. A compliant water fountain today has both a high-low bowl, but there's also no way to get to this if you're a person who uses a mobility device. And on the right, we've got no route leading to this playground and to the bench, the blue bench that runs along the right side of the picture.
Another thing to note with the picnic tables that you mentioned in the beginning is making sure that they are accessible to get to, but as well as that, making sure that they are of accessible design. So making sure that somebody maybe in a wheelchair could roll up to the side of them and have the knee clearance and toe clearance needed.
Corey, you all buy your tables, right? You don't make them?
Correct.
All right. So a couple other things that we saw in parks and play areas. The picture on the left is a transfer system, actually the left and the picture in the center. This is designed for a child who uses a mobility device to wheel up, boost himself out of his chair, drag himself by his fanny across the transfer platform, and then drag himself up those stairs so that he can use the slide and have as much fun as everybody else does. But the restrictions on height are pretty severe here. So the picture on the left shows the top of the surface at 21 inches. And the standards require it that it be between 11 to 18 inches above the ground. Now, this could have been poorly installed. It could be a maintenance issue in the sense that there's kick out of the surface underneath. It could be both, but we're not trying to find out why it's not compliant. We're just going to note that it's not compliant and it needs to be reduced to at least no higher than 18 inches. We also saw some surfaces that are sand. Sand is never an accessible route. Neither is pea gravel, neither is wood chip. So, you know, sand has great play value, but if sand's going to be present in a playground, there have to be other surfaces so that a person can get across them. I think just a quick comment too about seat height. Ground level play components like a swing that you have to mount to use cannot be higher than 24 inches above the ground. So this is, I don't see a tight dimension on it, but this is likely higher than that. Restrooms, one of the oldest designs known to man, but we frequently see quite a few pieces in them that are wrong. So here the lavatory on the left is mounted too high, and the pipes underneath lack insulation. So that's a $19.99 retrofit that's easy enough to make for the pipes. You do have some unique sites. Tatum, did you see these two?
I sure did, yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the miniature golf?
Yeah, so the miniature golf, I believe it was at East Park. There are some unique rules with mini golf, and one of them is that 50% of the putting spaces have to be accessible and they have to be consecutive. And so one of the issues with the mini golf at East Park was the first one is not accessible. You can't get around that that thing in the middle, and then the path on the side was not compliant to get around as well. And so we couldn't even really consider beyond that because you can't get to another green without going through that one. That mini golf had multiple issues with changes in levels. The paths from each hole were too narrow. There were just quite a few issues with that one. I know that some of you guys that are participating in this mentioned that you go to the rodeo stadium, and that also had a bunch of issues with accessibility. The assembly area, the bleachers weren't on an accessible route. There wasn't any way to get onto the bleachers themselves. The parking there actually wasn't on an accessible surface, although there was accessible parking. And then somebody in a wheelchair couldn't park their wheelchair at the front of the rodeo space because the vision or the viewing wouldn't be possible at that point. You kind of need to get on top of those bleachers to be able to see and view what's going on in the rodeo.
Thanks, Tatum.
Yep.
So a couple other comments about dog parks. I mean, these are very much an important and popular asset in a lot of communities. The key to the dog park is having an accessible route. So in the picture on the left, you can see there's signage. It looks like there's a bench in the picture in the bottom center. So wherever you put a human-made asset or signage or a water fountain or something like that, there's got to be an accessible route that leads to it. You're not going to be able to open the 2010 standards and find the section on dog parks. It doesn't exist. So for things like dog parks, skate parks, disc golf, we apply the general accessible route and reach range concepts that are already in the 2010 standards.
I think another thing that to point out is that we went to a couple of the dog parks in Los Alamos, and I don't think any of them had an accessible route to them. And so scoping would be something to consider in dog parks. You know, if there are 10 dog parks in the city, can we make 3 of them accessible? That 30% rule.
Yeah, and I think the route to the site is an important item to reinforce.
Yeah.
There's a settlement agreement regarding playgrounds out of Iowa, where a jurisdiction had installed 2 brand new playgrounds, kind of against the wishes of 2 moms who have kids with disabilities. And neither of the playgrounds had an accessible surface, number one. Number two, neither of them had a route leading from parking or sidewalk to the playground. So again, grass and dirt are never an accessible surface, according to both the Access Board and the Department of Justice. So we just wanted to give you a peek at some of the things that we saw, Terry and Melissa and Lisa. And you know, your role is really important. The Department of Justice, not once but twice, at section 35.105 when they're talking about the self-evaluation requirement, and then again at 35.150D, they both require an opportunity for people who live in the community and have a disability to provide feedback on what they think the priorities for retrofits should be. And for us, it's really helpful for us to hear that. We're good at measuring, but we don't live in Los Alamos or White Rock. We're not you. And your voice is important in this process. And I think that's consistent with kind of the underlying mantra when the ADA was passed of nothing for us without us. So that is about our plan for tonight, except a brief discussion about what's next. So since we're already running out of 2021, we're likely back in 2022 in the winter and audit facilities, and then continue to draft site reports. There are more public feedback opportunities toward the end of the project. Our RC associates will conduct the statistically valid and reliable survey. We don't have a date fixed for that yet, but that's likely in the first quarter of 2022. And then we will start gathering all of our reports, the final report that summarizes the transition plan itself, all the site reports, the survey report, the community engagement report, and provide that to the county at some point in mid-2022. Today in the meeting at 3 o'clock, I mentioned that there are only 2 things that can affect our timing here. One, of course, is Los Alamos weather. We haven't figured out a way to fly right to Los Alamos yet. So that means we've got to go through Albuquerque and get ourselves up to you. But on the way home from the office after the first session today, it was all COVID all the time on the radio. So I think those are the only 2 things that would slow us from finishing site audits, and that would be weather and an uptick in COVID, which we certainly hope we don't encounter. And Corey, I should have mentioned this afternoon and I didn't. All of us in the accessibility practice are fully vaccinated, and we do have a pretty strict COVID protocol. If we're meeting with your staff indoors, we will have a mask on. And if we are outdoors auditing, we won't have the mask on, but we'll have it with us. And if your community members or your staff come up, we'll mask up. We'll do frequent hand washing. So we'll do what we can to mitigate and make sure that we don't pose a risk to you. So
I also want
that's,
to commend Los Alamos on whenever I was there, I saw everybody wore a mask. I thought it was really incredible that your guys' community was on it with mask wearing. Sorry to interrupt. I just had to mention that.
no,
Well,
that's a
thank
great
you.
point.
It was
And we're-
awesome. It was really great.
Our state is also still under mask mandates, as you also found out while you were here.
Yeah, I thought it was awesome. I went to the stores, and where I'm from, you do see people who aren't wearing masks, and it's frustrating. So I really appreciated that being in Los Alamos.
So Lisa or Melissa or Terry, do you have questions or comments, or did anything jump out at you that you'd like to discuss further?
So this is Lisa. I had a comment or two. One is a little bit of history on the miniature golf thing. So the county, as you know, at the age of our county and the age of our buildings, accessibility at all has been a big issue. And one of the first things I worked on when I got here was sidewalk cuts. There were no curb cuts anywhere in this town. And I got more thank you notes from ladies pushing strollers than anything for putting curb cuts and having sidewalks widened. But all of those pieces of equipment in that miniature golf course came from parks that we retrofit. But they were parts, we all had, all the parks in this community were theme, the tot lots were all themed. So nobody wanted to see those things pulled up and thrown away, but they were not safe and they were certainly not accessible. So we put them over in a mini golf course. So that that's where some of that came from. The
That's
community.
very creative. I love that. That's cool.
And then some of the other things you were talking about, program accessibility. Sites, yes, but program accessibility. We had a little bit of a confrontation probably 15 years ago at the pool where Ashley's physical therapist went swimming with her. Yet Ashley's physical therapist then was earning a paycheck on a county park, which was not permissible by the anti-donation clause or whatever. So the county wanted to say that it was going to cost me the $128 an hour for the therapist, plus the therapist then had to pay an additional $128 an hour to the county, since she was making money off of the use of a county facility. That didn't go over very well, and that was one of the things that I had to push very hard on, and that now is no longer an issue, because all I had to say was, well, who are you going to provide to go swimming with Ashley? Oh, we can't possibly do that. That's a serious liability for us. I said, well, then I'm paying somebody to go swim with Ashley, and so yeah, now if someone comes to the pool, the aide doesn't even have to pay the entrance fee to get in if they're swimming with Ashley. But it's things like that. How do you address how are the issues of things that come up in contrary, that are contrary to other current codes and laws?
We do give the county staffs that are our clients the benefit of our advice about how their policies and their programs comply with Title II. And that is a part of the scope here. We were focusing on physical issues, but our scope does include evaluating public-facing policies. I mentioned we don't cover Title I. That's not part of our scope. But we will look at public-facing policies and evaluate how the county invites and analyzes and fulfills requests for reasonable modifications.
But my question was, when the request for a reasonable modification such as that goes against an existing state law, which in New Mexico is the anti-donation clause, where a private person or a business cannot make money or operate their business off of a county facility. Yet how does that, when your individual with a disability must have someone who is trained, obviously to be in a pool with them or to be working the horse with them or whatever, you've got to have somebody trained to do that. And the county does not have,
Yeah.
it would be impractical for the county to keep people like that on staff sitting around waiting for Ashley to want to go swimming. Yet to allow the therapist into the pool at no additional charge goes against the state's anti-donation clause.
Lisa, I don't know. I think there's two comments that I'll make. This idea of the staff person being available, that happens in counties and cities all over the United States. So that's not an unusual practice, number one. Number two, and this does not come up very often, Title II, the statute, expressly prohibits a Title II entity from saying they're not going to do something because another Title II entity says they can't. So that fits with your example perfectly. It means that the state can't either enforce or impose a requirement that results in discrimination on a county or a city. So like I said, we don't see this very often, but it does arise. So I think I'd bring that up. I'd bring both those points up to help address your question.
Thank you.
Terry, you've unmuted.
I just wanted to say thank you.
Well, thank you for making time for not one, but two meetings.
Well, it was very informative and gave me some good ideas. Having walked many of these trails and trying to see if they're accessible or not.
Well, thanks for your continued participation. We know we'll see you later in the project as we are finishing the site evaluations. And Lisa, make a point of swapping information with Corey, and when I'm out there or when I'm interviewing staff about public facing policies and programs, it would be nice to meet you and talk in person about some of the concerns you have.
Absolutely. Thank you. And if my daughter had not been on another Zoom meeting this evening, she would have chimed in as well. So I would be interested in having you meet with her.
Okay, great.
Your voices are definitely heard and appreciated here. It's really good to hear from all you guys. My background's actually in social work, so I love advocacy and being a part of your community. And I just think it's really awesome you guys are all here.
Tatum, what was your last name?
Story, like you're reading a story.
Oh,
Thank you. I'm glad that y'all are here and working on this project. I'm looking forward to learning from what you do. And I always learn more from Lisa's comments and her, she's been in Los Alamos much longer than me, and I love learning a little bit more about the history of how things came to be here. So thank y'all for being here.
Well, we're happy to be here, but thank the county. The county's the one that decided this was an important initiative to undertake. So we look forward to seeing you all either in person or by way of Zoom. And I guess it's probably appropriate to say have a nice, safe holiday season here.
You
Thank
as well.
Thank you all so much for participating. This is valuable information. If you know anybody else that wants to stay in tune with this, please let us know. And as John said, this is the first of several opportunities we're going to have a community dialogue about this. So again, I appreciate your time and thank you so much.
All right, thanks everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Good night.